In this episode, I will share my views on education. I'll start with my personal education history. I went to a Montessori preschool and kindergarten. I started violin lessons at age 5, which I continued through high school. I went to parochial grade school and high school. I went to a public state university, UIUC, where I studied chemical engineering. While I was at college, I also received I guess you could say, a spiritual education at a local Krishna center in my free time. After graduating college, I moved into a temple and continued my spiritual education. Since then, I have just been engaged in continuing education for career development and just learning new things about topics that I find interesting. I am also getting quite an education through just being a husband and a father. I have a daughter and a son now. So ever since my wife and I started planning to have kids, I have been thinking about what type of education I would want to provide for our kids. I looked into public schools, homeschooling, unschooling, Montessori, Waldorf, Gurukul, parochial schools, and some other alternative schools. I kept going back and forth with the pros and the cons of all these different options, and I kind of still debate this to this day. I admit I've not looked into all the different types of education out there. This is an area that I've changed my mind about a lot, and I could very well see myself changing my mind again about in the future, especially as my kids get older. So in this video, I'm going to discuss 3 general types of education. The first one is traditional, the next one is progressive, and the last one I'll discuss is self-directed education. So I'll start with traditional education. Traditional education is what you would find in pretty much all public schools today. You'll also find this type of education in a lot of private schools, parochial schools, and even homeschooling. For the sake of this video, I will mostly reference public schools. As I see it, there are about 5 potential benefits of public schools. The first main benefit is that public schools often have more resources because these schools receive government funding. Public schools often have bigger buildings, more land, more staff, more equipment, and other facilities that many private schools cannot afford. Many students also receive free transportation, there are free or reduced lunch programs, and there are learning disability services. The second benefit of public schools is socialization. Because there are typically more people enrolled in public schools, there may be more opportunities for exposure, to a broader and sometimes more diverse group of people. And since the school will be in close proximity to your home, your kids will likely live close to their classmates, which makes social time outside of school a lot easier to arrange. The public school itself also generally offers more opportunities for socialization. There are sports, proms, clubs, and various other activities. Another potential benefit is that there are often more opportunities for parents to get involved in the school. There are local PTOs and other organizations that support the school. The next potential benefit is that public schools offer a structured education, which works well for some kids. I met some parents who say their kids love going to public school. And then the last benefit that I'm aware of is that public schools offer a default education option. With all the education options out there, it can be paralyzing for some parents to decide which option is the best for their children. So having a default can be comforting for some parents. So now I'm going to point out the drawbacks of public schools. In general, I believe the drawbacks of public schools outweigh the benefits. Alfie Kohn does a great job of elucidating some of the problems with public schools, so I will present a lot of his ideas here. So the first core drawback of public schools is that there is a great amount of force involved. Education does not work so well when it is forced. Public schools force children to spend so much time sitting in seats, doing stuff that is, boring, doing stuff that has no meaning in their life, that truly isn't that important to do, depriving them of their instincts to be healthy, to get up, to run around, to do things that they want to do, to develop real passions, and other things. In fact, Alfie Kohn, he goes so far as to say that public schools engage in government-sanctioned child abuse. The next core drawback of public schools is that they are very impersonal. Public schools have more or less the same curriculum for everyone, which really doesn't make sense. Why does everyone in kindergarten do the same thing? Also, why do teachers prepare a syllabus for kids that they have never met? This means that who you are is irrelevant. Teachers don't care who you are or what you need individually or what interests you. The next core drawback of public schools is that public schools squash intrinsic motivation. Kids are more or less told what to do every day. Kids have almost nothing to say about their own learning. When kids have no say in their own learning, intrinsic motivation suffers. So intrinsic motivation also suffers when schools try to control students through reward and punishment. Rewards and punishment do work to an extent. They can get you to do things that you don't want to do. They are great for a repetitive job or household chores. In a research setting, rewards, which, including money, work to get people to do simple tasks faster and more productively. But when it comes to more creative or interesting tasks, for example, figuring out multiple solutions to a problem or painting a picture, things like that, people who are rewarded or punished, for that matter, their performance on a task actually becomes worse at it over time. And when the motivator is taken away, they are much less likely to continue the activity than people who were never rewarded or punished in the first place. So Daniel Pink says in his book, A Whole New Mind, this is one of the most robust findings in social science. That means much of what we do in schools is counterproductive. We want kids to love reading, so we reward them. When the rewards stop coming, the kids are less likely to choose reading as an activity in their free time. The typical setup of school can work to get a child to pass a test or to proceed to the next grade, but when it comes to producing kids who love literature, who love chemistry, who love coding or history, it's doomed to failure, despite the excellent intentions of most of the adults involved. The next drawback of public schools is that they are just woefully inefficient. Public schools spend ridiculous amounts of money for each student. For example, Chicago public schools spend over $27,000 per student per year, while the average Chicago private school tuition is about $11,000. So it's a big difference. Also, because of all the bureaucracy involved with public schools, these schools are not able to adapt with the times, especially now when technology is completely reshaping the world very rapidly. Making any change in public schools is like, trying to turn the Titanic or something. The next major drawback is that public schools focus on performance and achievement over actual learning. I feel that I performed and achieved fairly well in school according to conventional standards. However, I feel that I did not really learn a whole lot. I was really good at studying, just enough to get A's on tests, but as soon as the test was over, I pretty much just forgot everything right away. Focusing on performance and achievement means focusing on how well kids do something. Performance and achievement are not bad things. When it comes to things like, running a business or evaluating candidates in a, somewhat objective way, performance and achievement are really important. Most companies, they have what are called key performance indicators, KPIs. And KPIs tell you how well you do whatever it is that you do. It could be, selling cars, raising funds, or constructing buildings. Every company does things, and KPIs tell you how well you do those things. Peter Drucker, arguably, the world's greatest management consultant, is often quoted as saying that you can't manage what you can't measure. Drucker means that you can't know whether or not you are successful unless success is defined and tracked. So it is important to measure and track things, but it is important to measure and track the right things. There's this phenomenon called Goodhart's law. This says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Why? Because people start to game the system. This is clearly demonstrated in this example. So when the British ruled India, they wanted to reduce the cobra population, so they paid a bounty for bringing in dead cobras to the authorities. So enterprising Indians quickly figured out that they could earn money by raising cobras to kill and then present them to the authorities for bounties. So in this example, the number of dead cobras ceased to be a good measure because the government made it the target. So, success is not measured by KPIs. You can be the best at what you do and still fail miserably at why you do it. Success should be based on how well you fulfill your why, your purpose, your mission. When we forget our mission, we compile KPIs as if they were pillars to success, but they aren't. So I believe that a lot of schools fall into this trap of, compiling KPIs for kids' performance and often forget the purpose of school, which I believe is to, gain the skill and education needed to live autonomously and successfully. When it comes to learning and gaining skills, performance and achievement are often not the best marker of success, and it might actually hinder the learning process. People learn by trying new things and failing. If kids are only trying to perform and achieve all the time, it may result in good grades and high test scores, but it often comes at the cost of not really learning anything. There are also other negative effects of overemphasizing achievement. So I'll just bring up some of them that, Alfie Kohn highlights. So the first negative effect of overemphasizing achievement is that kids become less interested in the learning itself. The more you get kids focused on performing well in school, the less likely they are to enjoy, playing with words or numbers or ideas. They are less likely to be interested in a whole discipline like writing or science. They are likely to find school itself as something they have to get through because now the point isn't to make sense of stuff, it is to get better at it. These are two completely different frames of mind. The second negative effect of overemphasizing achievement is that kids tend to pick the easiest possible task, regardless of whether it is beneficial or not. So students are incentivized to not take intellectual risks. The fact that the schools encourage students to get good grades means that the system is encouraging students to avoid things that are challenging. Of course, students are picking the shortest book. Of course, students are picking projects that they're already familiar with. Of course, students are taking, Spanish, even though that they're already fluent in the language, et cetera, et cetera. These are more surefire ways to get good grades. Picking more challenging things or things that they're not familiar with may result in lower grades. So why would a student do that? Why would a student read a book that is not required? Or why would a student ever not read a stupid book that is required? So students are not in the school to use their judgment. Researchers found that when you get rid of all rewards and get rid of all grades, children spontaneously pick harder things to do, something just beyond what they are comfortable or capable of doing. The third negative effect of overemphasizing achievement is that kids tend to fall apart when they stop succeeding. When the kid who always gets 100% gets a 92%, the world has ended for that kid. Or, when a kid did really well in high school, but then they get to college and suddenly everyone is smart. And then again, the kid falls apart. So the last negative effect of overemphasizing achievement that I'm going to mention here is that kids tend to be less successful at meaningful indicators of intellectual proficiency. If you just give multiple choice tests of how many forgettable facts you've crammed into short-term memory, some of the kids with a strong achievement orientation will do well on those tests. However, the more meaningful the measures of learning, the more it turns out that the kids who are pushed hardest to succeed, they're often the least successful, especially at being able to transfer or generalize something about a lesson and apply it to a new kind of problem. The next drawback of public schools is the segregation by age. Kids are separated by age, and there are not a lot of opportunities for kids to interact with other aged kids. I believe that it is healthy for children's development to interact with kids of different ages. It is mutually beneficial when older kids teach young kids and younger kids learn from older kids. Segregation by age also causes students to focus on achievement versus learning. The next drawback of public schools is the rigid schedule. It often takes an indeterminate amount of time to really, get into a particular subject. Schools have, rigid class periods, and, as soon as the, 55 minutes are up, the bell rings, and it, doesn't matter if that you were on the verge of an epiphany and you just needed a little more time to dwell on a particular subject to really, make the light bulb go, turn on. That doesn't matter. You have to stop whatever it is that you were doing and get up and leave for the next class. So the schedule trumps learning. And, according to a University of California Irvine study, it takes an average of about 23 minutes and 15 seconds to get back, to a task after a distraction. The next drawback of public education is the homework, or, what it is most of the time, which is just busy work. It is cruel to make kids work an equivalent of a second shift when they get home. Homework is literally all pain and no gain. It produces frustration, exhaustion, family conflict, less time for kids to do the stuff that they care about, and just loss of interest in learning. Homework may be the greatest extinguisher of curiosity yet invented. No study has ever found any benefit of any kind of homework, below the high school level. And increasingly, newer studies are raising questions if this is even necessary in high school. More high school teachers are stopping giving homework at all. These high school teachers found absolutely no sacrifice, intellectually speaking. In fact, it can be argued that it is intellectually advantageous to not give homework. Also, what right does the school have to determine what families do during family time? We have become so used to this that we don't even ask about it anymore. The next drawback of public education is the tests. Most tests are not useful or necessary. Tests typically don't measure stuff that actually matters. Tests usually measure what matters least. Tests create more anxiety and pressure. A study evaluated 50 of the best teachers, and they found that these teachers almost never gave tests. There are better ways to gauge a student's understanding of a subject without ever giving tests. The next drawback of public education is the grades. There's absolutely no good reason to give grades. You don't even need them to get into universities. They are inherently flawed and completely unnecessary. Yet we persist in giving grades and blaming the kids. All studies that compare giving grades to not giving grades conclude that those who have been given grades, one, they become less interested in the task. There's a diminution in intrinsic motivation. Two, they pick the easiest possible task. And three, they think in more superficial fashions. So sometimes teachers think that we are giving too many A's, and, they purposely make getting good grades harder. This actually just makes it worse. The problem is not how many kids get A's. The problem is kids who think the whole point of going to school is to get A's. So this brings me to the next drawback, which is that public schools make things hard simply for the sake of being hard. There's this cult of rigor, as Alfie Kohn says, harder is better. This means that there's an assumption that a more difficult test or text or teacher or class is necessarily a higher quality one. You might hear a parent say, I don't think my kid is being challenged enough. But not many say, I'm not seeing my child wake up and, be excited about reading. The focus is often, is it hard enough? So judging a school on the basis of how rigorous it is like judging an opera on the basis of how many high notes it contains that are really difficult for, singers to hit. If something is too hard, it makes me feel stupid. Also, if something is too easy, it is boring. So optimal difficulty is not the same thing as maximal difficulty. A perfect example of this is AP courses. These are almost always the most difficult classes in a high school. Does this mean they are the best? Not really. Often AP classes accelerate the worst forms of instruction. These classes tend to be lecture-based, textbook-driven, and designed for the purpose of not thinking like a scientist, historian, etc., but instead they result in students thinking in terms of, getting a 3, a 4, or 5 on a test. So the final drawback of public education that I will list here is that there is little opportunity for play. It is widely accepted that play is crucial for the development of children. However, the trend in public schools is that school days are longer and there's less recess. Public schools demand so much from children, and there does not seem to be any thought about what kids are missing because of all the homework, tests, and school. So, that about sums up my thoughts on public schools. The next type of education I will discuss is progressive education. So you'll find this type of education in schools like Montessori and Waldorf. Schools can be rated as more or less progressive to the degree that they are committed to the following 8 ideas. So 1, attending to the whole child, not just to academics. 2, community. 3, collaboration. 4, social justice. 5, fostering intrinsic motivation. 6, deep understanding. 7, active learning. And 8, taking kids seriously. I believe that progressive education is an improvement on traditional schooling, but it is still not, the best option, in my opinion. So a lot of the ideas I present in this section will be taken from Dr. Peter Gray. As far as improvements go, the first improvement of progressive education is that it focuses more on project-based learning or learning by doing. This contextualizes the learning. It makes learning relevant to students' real-life experiences. It encourages critical thinking and deep understanding rather than, rote memory. It focuses on group work and collaboration rather than competition. It evaluates based on products rather than tests. The next main set of improvements with progressive education is that they generally have less or no homework. So, children actually have a life outside of school. They allow more time for recess and play, and they are less focused on standardized testing. The next potential improvement is that progressive educators tend to view education as a collaborative endeavor between students and their teachers. This is an improvement over the traditional way of teaching, which is, very top-down model. Teachers in progressive schools are allowed to be more flexible and responsive to children's needs. Promoters of progressive education commonly talk about educating the whole person and about, they talk about student-focused as opposed to, simply subject-focused education. Progressive teachers are expected to get to know all of their students as individuals and bring out the best in each of them. A good deal of initiative comes from the students, but the teacher is ultimately responsible to guide that initiative in productive ways. The child's intrinsic interests play a large role, but the teacher nurtures or even brings out those interests in the child. Play is understood to be a part of the learning process, but the teacher guides and interprets that plays in ways designed to ensure certain educative ends. And the last potential improvement I will list here is that there's a fair amount of research that shows that the graduates of more progressive schools tend to do better in life, at least by traditional measures, in terms of satisfying careers, happier with their schooling, things like that. So while progressive education is an improvement on traditional education, as with most things, there are drawbacks. So I'll just point out 2 of the main drawbacks here. The first drawback is that it is expensive. Schools that operate in accordance with progressive principles, they require small classes, a high ratio of teachers to students, and they require extraordinarily competent, dedicated teachers. So this type of education is extremely demanding on the teachers. Not only do they have to know the subject matter inside and out, but they have to know a lot about, how to teach. They have to get to know all their students as individuals, and they have to help each student develop their full potential and their own interests. So it is, it's way too demanding of teachers to be practical on any sort of mass scale. And it makes unrealistic assumptions about the predictability and visibility of human desires and motives. The second drawback is that it is still compulsory. The teacher or school drives the curriculum versus the students. As long as teachers believe that it is their task to make sure that children learn certain things at certain times in their development, then no matter how progressive they're thinking, they will have to use coercive methods to get children to do that. Children do not, by nature, all develop similar interests at the same time, so it is impossible to operate in anything like a typical classroom with more than a handful of students, on the assumption that all the students will learn the expected curriculum by doing what interests them. So this brings me to the final type of education I will discuss, which is self-directed education. This type of education is sometimes also known as unschooling, or world schooling, or free schooling. An example of this type of education includes Sudbury schools and agile learning centers. Again, I will mostly be sharing ideas about this type of education from Dr. Peter Gray. Self-directed education is where the learner has control over what they are learning and when and how they learn it. So this approach allows children to choose what they do, and it trusts that they will become educated without being made to follow a curriculum. A learner can do what looks like nothing, and no one will bother them about it. Self-directed education communities, still foster a safe environment, where kids will be happy and where the opportunities for learning are available. But there are no forced tests, homework, and grades, and there's no segregation by age. So far, I find self-directed education to be the best type of education. Why? Well, for one, all education is self-directed education. All education comes from the active mind and exploration of the person who is being educated. Education does not work with the idea that the learner is a passive recipient. The next reason I find self-directed education to be the best is because it's practical. It is much less trouble for everyone. It is more efficient, and it is less expensive to implement. Self-directed education schools are, cheaper than most progressive education schools, and it is definitely cheaper than the amount of money spent per student at a public school. The next reason is that humans are biologically designed for self-directed education. Children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves. We don't need to educate children. The world, I believe, will be better when we stop talking about educating children and start providing the kind of world and the environment that children need to educate themselves. The biological drives include curiosity, you which leads to knowledge, playfulness, which leads to skills, and the other drive is willfulness. So if you read accounts of how children learned before schooling became the norm, and how they still learn today when they don't go to school, they learn through a process of play, exploration, asking questions, observing, and interacting with others. Studies of children in Guatemala who are not schooled describe a state of alert awareness. Outside of school, children learn through participating in life, and given the right circumstances, they can become competent adults through doing so. We have lost faith that children can do this, but school is really a very recent arrival in the scene. If we think about the whole of human history, universal schooling only arrived in the UK in 1893. The reason self-directed education works is that children come into the world burning to educate themselves. They're so curious, so playful, so social. They've got these built-in drives for the purpose of education. Children learn so much before they even go to school. We shut off these drives when children go to school. It's quite deliberate. Schools came to teach conformity and obedience, not to promote, all of education as we think of it today. The next reason I find self-directed education, to be the best is because it results in happier children. With self-directed education, there is an extreme respect for individual autonomy. When people feel powerless, they are often unhappy and anxious. Yet, schools work by removing power from children. The main choice that children have at school is, whether to comply or to rebel. And if they rebel, they will get in trouble. In self-directed education communities, there's no judgment. Children are just allowed to be. There's no comparing children. You can't really be honest with someone who is judging you. You can't have a genuine relationship with someone who is judging you. You go into oppression management mode when someone is judging you. If someone is going to decide your grade or whether you pass or fail or whether you make it or you don't make it, you may not be really honest with that person, with all the things that you're not good at. You will want to put on the best show you possibly can. You'll want to show off to that person. Judging makes you anxious, and anxiety inhibits learning. There are many examples of children who are diagnosed with SENS or special educational needs or disability, when they were in the public school system. But when these kids are outside of the school system, these children thrive in a different way. These children were sometimes developing on very different schedules compared with school children. They might be learning to read later, or they might be playing imaginatively until they were older, or they might only start really interacting with other children at later stage. And outside of school, this doesn't really matter. They could take the time that they need. Also, the school environment itself is not often conducive for children with autism or ADHD. The assembly, the chaos of the playground, the noisy dining hall, smelly toilets, where people can climb underneath the doors. All of these things could add up to an intensely stressful environment for some children. School requirements often add a layer of distress and misery on top of these kids' differences. The last reason I find self-directed education to be the best is because it helps kids go on to lead a satisfying and meaningful adult life. Children learn the skills, knowledge, and character traits that prepare them for the rest of their life. There have been self-directed education schools that have been going on since, the 1960s. Dr. Peter Gray completed rigorous studies of the graduates from these schools. These graduates, they came from a range of backgrounds. They did not all come from educated families. In fact, many came precisely because they were doing poorly in public schools. They had learning disabilities or something like that. So Peter Gray's research concludes that self-directed education does not limit the student's future in any kind of way. Self-directed education was not a barrier, to getting into college. The students that wanted to go to college, they went on to college. Graduates went to the whole range of colleges, from community colleges to Ivy League universities. And the graduates were able to support themselves and live independently as adults. There was a disproportionate number of musicians and artists that came out of these schools, including some who went on to become very successful. But, there were also graduates that became, scientists, entrepreneurs, and, just about every type of profession that society finds valuable. And there's more and more reason to believe that self-directed education helps people thrive better in our economy today. So our economy needs people who are self-directed more than ever before. You can't expect to get a job nowadays, where you spend your days doing the same thing over and over again. You learn one skill, and that is all you ever need to know. So you're going to have to continue to learn your entire life, and that learning is going to have to be largely self-directed. You're going to have to figure out what it is that you have to do to get the job that you want and, to pursue the job that you want. Almost nobody has secure jobs these days. You need to be ready and willing to, roll with the punches, embrace risk, deal with failure, stuff like that. And these are the things that children who are practicing self-directed education are dealing with all the time. The children are always responsible for their own activities. They're always, figuring out how to learn what they want to know, and they're always trying out things, and sometimes failing and sometimes succeeding. I like this tweet from Christopher Voss. He says that your success rate in anything is higher when you forget about failing and you just focus on learning. There's much less of a transition for, self-directed educated children, from the world of child and adolescence into the world of adulthood. Very often, many of them have gone on to careers that are just extensions of the same activities that they've been doing as kids. Another interesting thing about self-directed education is that if students that were in a self-directed education school decide to go to a public school at some point, it's generally not a difficult transition for them. These students just go in there and fit right in. And they're not behind. Even though all of the other kids have been doing homework and passing tests and reading textbooks and all the other tasks from prior grades, the knowledge does not really stick from one grade to the next. This just kind of shows you how little is actually being learned by those who have been going to public schools all along. While self-directed education works really well for most students, it is important to say that it does not work well for everyone. Self-directed education does not work so well if the parents are psychologically depressed people, who are not providing a happy home. Unschooling works if you have a well-functioning family and a family that is well-connected with the community. It is not good for kids to just grow up with their parents as their only models, even if they have the best parents. And it is not good to only have their siblings as their only playmates. So it is really important to grow up with a sense of, connection to a larger community. And if you go to a Sudbury school, you are getting that through the school, which is a larger community. And if you are doing that at home, it is important that you are growing up in a family that has those kinds of connections and can facilitate those kinds of connections. So now I'm going to share what I plan to do for my kids. So I certainly like the philosophy of self-directed education the best, but I can't fully get over my feelings of, wanting to make sure that my kids develop certain key skills, whether they want to develop them or not. So there's this group that I'm a part of called Almost Unschoolers, and I think I resonate with the general idea behind this group. So I'm considering a, mostly self-directed education approach. But I plan to strongly encourage or possibly make some specific things mandatory for my kids. Naval Ravikant said that the most important skills for people to learn are reading, writing, arithmetic, persuasion or talking, and computer programming. So, I pretty much agree. I feel that having these skills will help my kids to pursue their own interests in a better way and overall increase their opportunities and ultimately freedom in this world. For reading, I think I'm coming around to the idea that, the best way to teach a child to read is by following the lead of the child. So this means that the child will learn to read whenever they're interested in learning to read, and they will learn to read in whatever way that they want to learn to read, whatever is natural to the child. Choice is the secret recipe to foster a love of reading. Kids innately know the best way for them to learn. When we had our first kid, I used to think that it was important for kids to learn to read early so that, that they'll be ahead of everyone else the rest of their lives. I was even thinking about doing this, children learning reading program, that teaches your child how to read, even by the age of 2. Now I have, a very different view. Now I think forcing your kids to read early unnecessarily pressures kids without any upside. There are at least 3 studies that compared kids who received, early academic training, teaching kids, pre-reading and number skills in a deliberate fashion. And then they compared those kids with kids who were in a play-based setting. So the kids who went to these, academic preschools, they did perform better in reading when they were in first grade. However, by 3rd or 4th grade, if not earlier, that early advantage in reading not only washed out, but it actually reversed. So by 4th or 5th grade, the kids who were in the play-based preschools and kindergartens, they were actually doing better in every measure, social and academic, than the kids who were in these academic training preschools. And these were similar kids in controlled studies. So, I kind of come to the conclusion that children can learn to read anytime. Practically everyone learns how to read at some point. It is even easier to learn to read when you are older than when you're younger. The kids who are not reading are still doing all kinds of interesting things that, don't involve reading. And it's not the case that everyone will learn at age 6 when, we let them learn on their own. Some will learn at age 6, some will learn at age 4, some much later. And learning to read really does not have to do with brain development so much. Rather, it has to do with when the child is interested in reading, when it is meaningful to them, when they actually want to learn how to read. You can't grow up in a literate culture without learning that there is some value in reading, and therefore at some point, you learn how to read. So for me, I have a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old. So they're not really reading yet. I'm currently just, regularly reading, primarily with my 2-year-old at this point, when she is interested. And I allow her to choose what we read. As I read with my kids, whenever they are ready and interested, I plan to just, kind of help them read, help them, sound out words that they don't know, help them understand the context of the sentences, and just kind of be there to help them with whatever they need. For writing and persuasion, I plan to do a similar approach that I'm doing with reading. I mostly plan to just follow my kids' lead. However, I could see myself strongly encouraging my kids to, write blogs, scripts for YouTube videos, tweets, articles, etc., about things that interest them. I could also see myself encouraging my kids to follow some, great writers and speakers and thinkers, on Twitter and YouTube and, whatever other, mediums there are, and to learn how to write, persuade, speak and think from these people. Perhaps I will encourage them to do something like, Toastmasters, or join a debate club, or join a comedy team, or, something like that. Also, I just hope to provide my kids with ample opportunities to socialize with other people and make, connections in a larger community. For math, I hear that Khan Academy has some great courses for learning all the math that most people would ever need to know. So I might encourage my kids to take courses on Khan Academy, or, Brilliant, Brain Pop Junior, or do some other math program that works better for them. Wesley Yang has a tweet that shows just how quick and easy it can be for kids to learn math. He tweeted, homeschooling showed me that you can teach the K-5 math curriculum to a 6-year-old in 6 weeks with 1 hour of instruction per day. For computer programming, I don't know a ton about it myself, but I do want to provide them opportunities so that they can be proficient at this. I plan to sign them up for something like, Code Ninjas, and then, just encourage them to further their computer programming skills through, programs like the Sailor Academy or Lambda School or company certifications or whatever other relevant programs that are available. For general logic or critical thinking and problem-solving skills, I plan to sign them up for Synthesis School. Chrisman Frank and Anna Lorena Fabrega, they're both associated with Synthesis School. They're great people to follow. So Synthesis School is an online school that brings the same level of education that Elon Musk's kids received to the world. So Synthesis School helps students with strategic thinking and collaborative problem solving. And it's done in a game-like fashion, so it is actually fun for students to learn. Synthesis School uses game design to teach children how to make decisions that have real-world consequences. So this school is constantly innovating, adapting, and growing, and I just really love the people behind it. So other than Synthesis School, I will also provide them access to video games and all kinds of other games, which I believe generally help with developing these skills. Then for miscellaneous other things like health, finance, taxes, technology, religion, values, etc., I'll probably just teach them what I know in an informal way, and I will just try to provide them with the good environment, the tools, and the resources that they need so that they can explore these things on their own. I'm currently not planning to send my kids to public schools, but if they want to go, I will certainly let them. There is a Sudbury school not too far from me, so I am considering signing my kids up to this school if I cannot provide sufficient connections to a larger community by myself. I'm also not ruling out progressive schools like Waldorf or Montessori. I may not fully agree with everything about progressive education, but given the options that are around me and our current life circumstances, it may be a decent option, or at least for some time. So ultimately, I understand that all kids are different, and I may have to just try different things and see what works for my kids and just do that. So that about sums up my views on education. That is all for this episode. Thanks for listening and take care.